Most people think growing tomatoes requires a big yard, a raised bed, or at least a decent patch of ground. They're wrong. A single 5-gallon bucket can produce more tomatoes than a poorly managed garden bed twice its size. But here's what nobody tells you. Most people who try bucket growing fail. Not because the method doesn't work, because they skip the steps that actually matter. They grab any bucket, throw in whatever soil they have, drop a plant in, and wonder why their tomatoes look stressed by July. What I'm going to show you today is a complete step-by-step system. Every step connects to the next one. Miss one, and the ones that follow won't work the way they should. This is the method that works. Let's get into it. Drop your country in the comments right now and tell me, have you ever tried growing tomatoes in a container before? I read every single comment, and knowing where you're gardening from helps me make content that actually fits your climate. Why buckets actually work for tomatoes? Before we get into the steps, let's talk about why this method works at all. Tomatoes are not as demanding about space as most people assume. What they are demanding about is root environment. They want warm soil, good drainage, consistent moisture, and enough room to anchor themselves. A 5-gallon bucket, set up correctly, delivers all 4 of those things better than a lot of garden beds. Here's why. In a bucket, you control the soil completely. There's no clay, no compaction, no competing weeds pulling nutrients away from your plant. The container concentrates root energy in a defined space, which means the plant isn't spending weeks searching for nutrients. It finds them immediately and pushes that energy straight into fruit production. The bucket also warms up faster than ground soil in early season, which tomatoes love, and because it's portable, you can chase sunlight. If one corner of your patio gets better afternoon sun in July, you move your bucket there. That flexibility alone makes container growing more productive for a lot of growers than a fixed garden bed. But here's the reality check. Most beginners fail at bucket growing for 3 reasons. They use the wrong soil. They don't set up drainage properly, and they water inconsistently, either too much or not enough. Every single one of those failures happens in the setup phase, which is exactly why this system starts at the very beginning. Step 1. Bucket setup. This is the foundation. Get this wrong and every step that follows is already compromised. First, the bucket itself. 5 gallons is the minimum for tomatoes. Not 4, not 3. Tomato roots need depth to anchor the plant and reach stable moisture zones. A 5-gallon bucket gives you roughly 12 inches of depth, just enough to support a healthy root system through a full season. If you can find 7-gallon or 10-gallon containers for a similar price, use them. More root space always translates to more yield in container tomatoes. Now, drainage. This is non-negotiable. If your bucket does not have adequate drainage, water sits in the bottom of the container. The lower root zone becomes waterlogged. Oxygen gets pushed out of the soil, and your roots begin to suffocate. Slowly, invisibly, weeks before you see any problem on the leaves. Drill at least 5 to 6 holes in the bottom of the bucket. Each hole should be roughly a 1/4 inch wide. Then drill 4 to 6 additional holes around the lower sides of the bucket, about 1 inch up from the bottom. Why the side holes? Because water pooling directly at the base of the bucket can still cause anaerobic conditions even with bottom drainage. The side holes create a drainage band that prevents that last inch of standing water from forming. This one detail separates buckets that produce well from buckets that struggle mid-season. Place the bucket on feet, small stones, bricks, or purpose-made pot risers, so the drainage holes aren't sitting flush against the ground. If drainage holes are blocked, they don't drain. Finally, placement. Tomatoes need a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day. Less than that and your plants will grow. They just won't fruit well. Pick your spot before you fill the bucket. A full bucket of wet soil is heavy. Position it once and leave it. If this step is wrong, your plant struggles from the very beginning, and no amount of good feeding or careful watering in later steps will fully recover it. Soil mix. This is where most people lose yield without ever realizing it. They go to a garden center, grab a bag labeled potting mix, fill the bucket, and consider the job done. That's not enough. Standard potting mix alone in a 5-gallon bucket compacts over time. It holds moisture unevenly, and it often doesn't provide the drainage speed that tomato roots need during heavy watering or rain. Here is the soil mix that works consistently in bucket tomatoes. 40% potting mix, 30% perlite, 20% compost, 10% coconut coir. Let me explain each one. The potting mix is your base. It holds structure and carries the primary nutrient load. Perlite is the drainage agent. Those small white particles create air pockets in the soil that prevent compaction and allow excess water to move through quickly. Without perlite, soil in a closed container will pack down by mid-season and start suffocating roots. Compost adds slow-release organic fertility. It feeds the plant gradually across the season without the spikes and crashes that synthetic fertilizers can cause in container growing. Chord, which comes from coconut husks, is a moisture regulator. It absorbs water and releases it slowly back into the root zone, which smooths out the wet-dry cycles that stress tomato plants between waterings. Do not use straight garden soil in a bucket, ever. Garden soil compacts immediately in a container environment. It doesn't drain, it doesn't aerate, and it often introduces weed seeds, fungal spores, and pest eggs into what should be a clean growing environment. This soil mix is the foundation your plant will live in for the entire season. It is worth the extra 10 minutes and small additional cost to get it right. And this step directly determines how well your roots develop in the next phase. So don't rush it. Step 3. Choosing the right tomato variety. Not every tomato is suited for a 5-gallon bucket. This is something a lot of beginner guides skip over, and it leads to growers fighting their plants all season instead of harvesting from them. The key distinction is determinate versus indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes grow to a fixed height, usually 2 to 4 feet. They produce all their fruit in a concentrated window and then stop. These are ideal for containers because they stay manageable. They don't require aggressive staking, and their compact size means the root system isn't competing with excessive top growth. Indeterminate tomatoes keep growing all season. Left unsupported, they can reach 6, 8, even 10 feet. In a bucket, that amount of top growth puts serious strain on a root system that only has 5 gallons of space. It's manageable, but it requires consistent pruning and strong support. For 5-gallon buckets, the best choices are Roma, Patio, Bush Early Girl, Celebrity, and Tumbling Tom. These varieties were either bred specifically for container growing or naturally stay compact enough to thrive in limited root space. If you want to grow beefsteak or Cherokee Purple or another large indeterminate variety in a bucket, you can, but you'll need a larger container, aggressive pruning, and consistent feeding. It's a higher maintenance commitment. For beginners, start with a compact determinate variety. Get 1 full season of results. Then experiment with larger varieties once you understand how your growing conditions behave. Your variety choice directly affects how you set up support in a later step. Step 4. Planting the tomato. This step surprises a lot of new growers because it goes against instinct. When you plant a tomato in a bucket, you want to plant it deep, very deep. Strip the lower leaves from your transplant. Any leaves that would sit below the soil line once planted. Then bury the stem up to the lowest set of remaining leaves. Why? Because tomato stems are unique. Any part of the stem that gets buried in moist soil will develop roots. That means a 6-inch transplant planted deep becomes a plant with a root system extending across the full buried length of the stem, giving it far more anchoring capacity and water uptake than a shallowly planted transplant of the same size. In a 5-gallon bucket, this matters enormously. You're working with a limited root zone. Deep planting maximizes every inch of it. Center the plant in the bucket. Give it room on all sides. Pack soil gently around the stem, firm enough to eliminate air pockets, but not so tight that you're compressing the soil structure you just built. Water gently immediately after planting to settle the soil around the roots. Then leave it alone for 2 to 3 days. New transplants need time to adjust to their root environment before they're ready to respond to feeding or aggressive watering schedules. This patience in the early days pays off significantly in root establishment, and root establishment is what the next step depends on entirely. Step 5. Watering strategy. This is the step that quietly ruins most tomato plants. Not disease, not pests, not bad soil, watering. Specifically, inconsistent watering. Tomatoes in containers dry out faster than tomatoes in the ground. The limited soil volume means there's less moisture reservoir to draw from between waterings. In hot weather, a 5-gallon bucket can go from well-watered to critically dry in 24 to 36 hours. Here is the system that works. Water deeply, not frequently. When you water, water until you see consistent drainage coming from the bottom holes. This ensures the entire soil column is moistened, not just the top few inches. Shallow watering trains roots to stay near the surface where they're vulnerable to heat and drying. Deep watering trains roots downward, toward the cooler, more stable zone of the container. Check moisture before every watering. Push your finger 2 inches into the soil. If it's still moist at that depth, wait. If it's dry at 2 inches, water now. In mild weather, most bucket tomatoes need deep watering every 2 to 3 days. In peak summer heat, especially if your bucket is in full sun, that may shorten to daily watering. Signs of overwatering. Yellowing lower leaves. Soil that stays wet for more than 3 days. Soft or darkening stem near the soil line. Signs of underwatering. Wilting in the morning before peak heat. Dry, cracked soil surface. Leaves that feel thin and papery. The goal is consistent moisture, not wet, not dry. A steady, reliable rhythm that roots can depend on. Inconsistency is the single biggest yield killer in container tomatoes. Blossom drop, cracked fruit, and poor fruit set are all downstream consequences of erratic watering. Get this step right, and the next step becomes significantly more effective. Step 6. Feeding and fertilizing. A tomato plant in a 5-gallon bucket is completely dependent on you for nutrition. Unlike ground-planted tomatoes that can send roots searching for minerals in surrounding soil, a bucket tomato can only access what's already in its container. That makes feeding non-negotiable. Here's the timeline. For the first 2 to 3 weeks after transplanting, hold off on fertilizer. The compost in your soil mix is providing background fertility. The plant is focused on root establishment, not fruit production. Adding high nitrogen fertilizer too early pushes leafy vegetative growth at the expense of root development. At week 3, begin a balanced fertilizer, something in the 10-10-10 range, once per week. Once you see the first flower clusters forming, switch to a lower nitrogen, higher phosphorus and potassium formula. Something like 5-10-10 or a dedicated tomato and vegetable fertilizer. Why the switch? Nitrogen drives leaf and stem growth. Phosphorus and potassium drive flowering, fruit set, and fruit development. Once your plant shifts into reproductive mode, its nutritional needs shift with it. Calcium is also critical for bucket tomatoes, more so than in-ground plants. Inconsistent calcium uptake causes blossom end rot. That dark, sunken patch on the bottom of tomatoes that ruins fruit that was almost ready to pick. The calcium-magnesium supplement added to your watering routine every 2 weeks from the flowering stage onward prevents this almost entirely. Feed consistently. Don't skip weeks. Don't double dose to make up for missed feedings. Consistent, moderate feeding always outperforms irregular, aggressive feeding in container growing. Step 7. Support system. This step is about protecting everything you've built so far. A tomato plant that collapses under its own weight or snaps a main stem in a wind event doesn't recover fully. That structural damage costs you weeks of production and in some cases the entire plant. Set up support at planting time, not after the plant is already leaning. For compact determinate varieties like Roma or Patio, a single sturdy stake driven into the bucket at planting, with the main stem loosely tied as it grows, is usually sufficient. For indeterminate varieties, use a tomato cage. Choose one that's at least 4 feet tall. Shorter cages get outgrown quickly and end up doing more harm than good once the plant flops over the top. When tying stems to stakes, Never tie tightly against the stem. Use soft ties, strips of cloth, or purpose-made garden tape. Leave slack for the stem to thicken as the plant grows. A stem tied too tightly early in the season will be cutting into the plant by mid-season, restricting water and nutrient flow through exactly the stem tissue that's feeding your fruit. Support protects yield. It's not optional. Step 8. Pruning and maintenance. Most people either over-prune or never prune at all. Both hurt yield. The key is understanding what to remove and what to leave. Suckers are the small shoots that emerge in the junction between the main stem and a branch, called the leaf axil. Left alone, suckers become full branches. On a compact container plant, too many branches mean too many places competing for the limited nutrition in your bucket. For determinate varieties, minimal pruning. Remove suckers only below the first flower cluster. Leave the upper growth largely intact because determinate plants produce on a fixed schedule, and aggressive pruning reduces that set harvest window. For indeterminate varieties and buckets, remove suckers below the second or third flower cluster regularly throughout the season. Maintain 1 to 2 main stems. This concentrates energy into the fruit that's already forming, rather than continuously feeding new vegetative growth. Also remove any yellowing or dead leaves throughout the season. These leaves are no longer photosynthesizing. They're just providing surface area for fungal spores to land and establish. Good airflow through the plant canopy is one of the simplest and most effective disease prevention strategies available to a container grower. It costs nothing and takes 2 minutes a week. Step 9. Common mistakes to avoid. Most people don't realize they're making these mistakes until the damage is already done. Overwatering is the most common. It feels like attentiveness, but it's the leading cause of root problems in bucket tomatoes. Check before you water, always. Poor drainage setup. If you skipped the side drainage holes or your bucket is sitting flush on a solid surface, fix it now, not next week. Every day of poor drainage costs root health. Wrong soil. If you filled your bucket with straight garden soil or a basic potting mix without amendment, your plant is likely already compacting. Top dress with compost and perlite now and plan to do the full mix correction next season. Not enough sunlight. 6 hours is the minimum. 8 is better. 10 is ideal. If your tomatoes are flowering but not setting fruit, inadequate sunlight is the most likely cause before you look at any other variable. Planting too shallow. If your transplant is sitting high in the bucket with only 2 or 3 inches of stem buried, the root system is underdeveloped. Deep planting at transplant time cannot be corrected after the fact. It's a decision you make once. These mistakes are fixable at the setup stage. Almost none of them are fixable mid-season without significant setback. Step 10. Harvesting your tomato. Everything you've done across these 9 steps leads to this moment. Tomatoes are ready to harvest when they reach full color for their variety and give slightly to gentle pressure. Do not wait for them to be completely soft. Soft means overripe. The sugars are already breaking down and the texture is declining. Pick at full color with just a little give. The flavor is at its peak. The texture is firm enough to hold up in cooking or eating fresh. When you pick, twist gently rather than pulling straight down. Pulling can damage the stem and the remaining fruit cluster above it. Here's something most guides don't mention. Picking regularly encourages continued production in indeterminate varieties. When fruit stays on the vine past peak ripeness, the plant reads that as a signal that its reproductive mission is complete, and it begins winding down. Keep picking, keep the plant producing. For determinate varieties, harvest will happen in a concentrated window, usually 2 to 3 weeks. Pick everything as it ripens, then evaluate the plant. Some determinates will push a second smaller flush if fed and watered well after the first harvest. Here's what a successful 5-gallon bucket tomato system looks like. A properly drilled bucket elevated for drainage. A custom soil mix built for aeration and consistent moisture. The right variety for container conditions. A deep planted transplant with maximum root development potential. Consistent deep watering on a schedule. Targeted feeding that shifts with the plant's growth phase. Solid structural support from day one. strategic pruning that protects airflow and concentrates energy, and a harvest approach that keeps the plant producing. That is the full system. Every step supports the one that follows. Skip one and the downstream steps become harder. Follow all of them, and a single 5-gallon bucket will produce more than most people expect possible from a container. Are you going to try this in a bucket this season? Drop it in the comments, I want to know. And if this video gave you a clear path forward, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more growers who need this information. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because next week we're going into something that almost every bucket gardener gets completely wrong at the fertilizing stage, and it's costing them yield they don't even know they're losing. I'll see you in the next video. Keep growing your backyard verdant.